Delighted to have Dr. Asya Metodieva on this week's episode of Conflict and Terrorism Studies with Wisdom. She has recently published a paper in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism titled The Radical Milieu and Radical Influencers of Bosnia Foreign Fighters. Hello, Asya. It's a great
Hello,
opportunity to
Wisdom.
talk with you today.
Very nice, and I'm really honored, and I'm very much looking forward for our talk today.
Thank you very much. So we'll start straight away. Uh, can you let us tell us a brief background and the research question of your paper? We want to understand the motivation for this paper and what are the debates or the puzzle or the policy issue that led to this paper.
All right, so my research and the research note that got published in January earlier this month is part of my PhD research, my dissertation, which focuses on the recruitment of Bosnian and also Albanian foreign fighters. The research note is only on the Bosnian case. These are the people who traveled to Syria to become foreign fighters between 2011 and 2016. And my initial idea was to find out whether the post-war societies they come from contributed to their engagement with violence. And my short answer would be yes, but maybe not in the way we might expect. So as I said, this research note focuses on the like part of the empirics I found while doing my fieldwork. And actually, I submitted my thesis in the same week when the Vienna attack happened in Europe in November 2020. And experts have argued whether this was a lone wolf attack or it was a one coordinated by the Islamic State. And this brings me to one of the key questions that my dissertation and this research note specifically raises. Is the recruitment of foreign fighters and jihadists in Europe leader-led or leaderless? And the second issue, which I personally find more intriguing, is to what extent and whether jihadists from the Balkans differ from those in Western Europe, whether the networks behind them are fundamentally different, and whether the legacy of domestic war has something to do with the recruitment of Balkan jihadists. And what basically encouraged my thinking when I started my research was that, like looking at the communities in Europe, the Muslim communities, they're not identical. For instance, the histories of the radical milieus across Belgium or Sweden differ from those in Bosnia or Kosovo. And it is not the failed integration of Muslim immigrants in a new wealthy society, which is one of the conventional arguments in the literature, but is rather the integration of radical micro-society after a war that made the radical socialization possible in the Balkan case. And the research question that guided me through all the years was how do post-war radical milieus shape the recruitment of foreign fighters in European context?
Oh, that's interesting. So you stated your argument inside, but based on this background, I want you to state your argument clearly again, so uh, viewers and listeners will get it straight what your argument is.
So my argument is that a post-war radical milieu is highly influenced by authority figures, and this matters to the geographical distribution of recruitment. Some people might say, yes, but this is more or less valid for other contexts, like whether it's Western Europe or in other contexts of recruitment, we have these local leaders or recruits who have bigger influence. But what I argue is that in a post-war context, their influence is even more incentivized just because radical influencers have access to particular ideological and material resources brought by the war. To put it simply, um, historically, jihadist Salafism didn't exist in the Balkans before the Bosnian War and the Kosovo War, when a lot of humanitarian organizations or Islamic NGOs came to the region and basically distributed humanitarian support to local populations. And within this context, there was a generation of radical influencers who persistently remained in the context between the local wars and the Syrian war when the recruitment of foreign fighters happened. In other words, it's about a combination of a context, movement, and narratives, or let's say the power of ideology used in a specific moment of time. And let me put it more clearly, I do not search for a direct link between the wars in the 90s and the number of individuals who traveled to Syria. Basically, my argument is not that, well, we have these post-war societies and this means that they would produce higher number of foreign fighters. Instead, I intended to connect the war and the post-war spread of radical values by religious charities or radical preachers and the gradual consolidation of a radical milieu that consequently led to some people to get involved in violence. And basically, this is a model that hypothesizes that recruitment followed the trajectory of radical influencers, not the war atrocities, not anything else that was brought by the conflict, but exactly the trajectory or the movement of radical influencers.
Oh, that's interesting, and thank you for that. So, what was your methodology, or what was the empirical approach? How did you test this argument?
As you know, in terrorism studies, access to data is probably the biggest challenge. And to this challenge, I would add also language barriers that I experienced and a lot of difficulties related to how to analyze the data I've collected. For the empirical part of my research, I spent approximately 6 months in total in the Balkans, conducted a very, let's say, limited number of interviews with returnees or like foreign fighters who went to Syria and returned, and also with their like families or people who belong to their social circles. But this helped me like to have different profiles of people who are part of this local context, helped me to draw the boundaries or to understand the boundaries of the so-called radical milieu. So I conducted approximately 40 interviews, not specifically for this research note, but for the entire research. Also meetings with security representatives, with like prosecutors or judges or police officers who follow this issue. And also, I collected more than 400 to 500 pieces that were published on local media, and this whole information helped me to identify people who traveled to Syria and also to analyze the biographies of radical influencers based on a number of selected criteria. For instance, I was looking at their backgrounds, where they come from, where they were based later, what type of activities they were involved. For instance, whether they took part in the war, whether they were part of some sort of Islamic NGOs after the war. So I was basically studying the biographies of radical influencers who were present in the local context between the domestic conflict and the recruitment of foreign fighters to Syria.
That's a beautiful one. So, what would you say are your key findings, your primary findings, if a researcher was to pick up your work? What would what would you expect the person to identify as your key findings in this paper?
So my main, let's say, goal was to be able to shift the conversation about foreign fighters from the recruits to their recruiters or from followers to influencers, if we use this social media
Yes.
terminology.
Yeah.
So in my research, I identified a generation of graduates of Islamic universities who promoted Salafism or Wahhabism in the early 90s, during and right after the war in the Bosnian context. They opposed the local tradition of Islam. They engaged in discussions with followers, both in person and online. And this was the way they influenced local communities and local clusters of followers. However, this doesn't mean that these people were leaders of terrorist organizations. And I make a very clear analytical distinction between radical influencers who engaged with violent actions and rhetoric and those who did not. And if I can summarize the key findings, I would say that foreign fighter recruitment was not leaderless uh, in the local context. And radical influence was a function of a context characterized by a war and post-war fragility. Very small number of foreign fighters, looking at their profiles, had some past experience in the local wars, which means that there is no straightforward link between personal experiences and their decision to go and be involved in violent actions again. But what is true is that, or what I found is that most of these people were socialized with radical influencers before going to Syria.
Wow. So what's the implication? What's the larger contribution of this paper or the implication of these findings to uh, to the literature in general?
As I said, I hope this is going to shift the discussion and the conversation, which is mostly about the profile or the radicalization of individuals who went to Syria, to shift it to those who had some sort of radical influence over the process of recruitment. This is, let's say, one of the key implications. And the second one is that we need more knowledge about social networks. And by studying the empirical cases of post-war societies in Europe, I think it contributes very much to this knowledge how these social networks are also connected to, for instance, diaspora communities in Western Europe. Because due to the wars, we have a lot of people who moved from the Balkans in the 90s to Western Europe, and based on these links, they established also radical communities that follow the pattern of immigration. So I would say that the paper and this research has implications for our knowledge about these social networks in a context.
Thank you for that. That's an interesting one. So, what, in your view, what are the limitations of this study, and how do you think other researchers who would want to expand on this or who want to further the research in this area could address these limitations? And again, what other what are the avenues that are available for expanding this study based on your current findings? And also, are you working, lots of questions in one? Are you currently working on another research that furthers your current findings?
So I will start from your last question.
Yeah.
With this research note that was published, it was basically the one of the attempts to get some of the empirical part out. But I hope that this whole project, which is again my PhD dissertation, is going to find its new life as a book in the next years. Of course, there is a lot of work to be done, but I would like to stay focused on the idea that radical milieus across Europe are not identical. And when we talk about, let's say, jihadists or radical influence and radical influencers, we need to have a closer look at the the local social dynamics, basically. And part of the limitations, again, access to data, access to supportive information concerning the background of activities of radical influencers. So basically, data about what these people were doing between 1995 and 2016 or 17. In some cases, was insufficient. For instance, their educational background or their social network, which basically gives the information about the history of radical socialization. And of course, very, very standard limitations that I experienced in data collection, like being, let's say, prevented from access to data from local security institutions due to the sensitivity of the topic. And something that I could try, I try to compensate by expanding my network of, let's say, journalists or local researchers who are more familiar with the local context. And I would say that there is a lot of work to be done in terms of seeing how followers or foreign fighters were connected to these local influencers. Based on the data I've collected, I cannot entirely say about the whole sample how every single individual were connected to local influencers, whether they were socialized, whether they knew each other, or they were basically following some of the leaders online or through Facebook and Twitter accounts. So this is something that I would say it is a limitation of the study.
Thank you. Just one more, but it's a part of the last question. Now, how do you advise researchers also to follow the same pattern you used in trying to limit or check your limitations?
I think that researchers in terrorism studies will benefit enormously if we cooperate more in terms of data sharing or exchange of information about the data we are collecting. Uh, Unlike other fields, I think that the richness of our research comes from the fact that we, like, part of our work is, let's say, very much close to journalism in terms of being close to the field, interacting with the field. And in this sense, everyone's work is very unique. It's hard to replicate it. Even when you go to the same country, the same region, you hear all the time, for instance, from people I talk to, oh, I talked to this person before, this researcher or this journalist, and this knowledge or exchange of data, whether it's about interviews or whether it's about contacts, would help enormously to basically make our field more supported by the findings we have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asya, for honoring my invitation to this program.
My
I
pleasure.
hope you join me again if I invite you to discuss another paper.
Yeah, with pleasure, and good luck with the podcast. And I'm very much looking forward to listening to the next episodes and also to hear the findings of other researchers in the field.
Thank you very much. Viewers and listeners, I want to appreciate you for listening to us, and please remember to rate us and make your comments on the app. Also, subscribe and follow us on this channel to enjoy this program straight on your device. You should also reach out to us if you would like to discuss your recent publications and on conflict and terrorism. My name is Wisdom Iyekikbolo. Bye for now. Thank you.